Hi, today we're going to be talking about present simple passive and past simple passive. This is a review, so let's pay attention. First of all, what is it? When do we use it? So, here we're going to be focusing on the passive voice for a situation in the past or in the present. Remember that we use passive voice to emphasize the action or the receiver of the action, or when the person doing the action, that would be the doer, is unknown or irrelevant. So let's move on. First of all, how do we make a sentence passive? When we want to make a sentence passive, what we do is we need to identify the elements that make up the sentence and then change the order of these elements. So, first we have a sentence in the active voice. He opens the door. If we want to change this sentence to the passive voice, first we need to identify the subject, in this case, he. We identify the verb, opens. And finally, the object, the door. And when we change it to passive voice, we can see that the object is going to become the subject. The verb has a few changes about which we will talk later on during this video. And finally, the subject becomes the agent. Be careful that the agent is not a mandatory element of the sentence in the passive voice. You can omit it, and that would be okay. However, if you do want to include the agent, remember to introduce it using by. So, as you can see here on the picture, we have changed all the elements of the sentence, and now the object has become the subject. That's going to be the most important part for you to remember. That means that the subject, the structure is going to be the subject, that used to be the object, followed by a form of the verb be. This form is going to change depending on the subject and the tense in which we want to speak. And finally, the verb changes to the past participle. This is the basic structure for all passive sentences. In this case, we're going to be focusing specifically on the present simple passive. When you want to change a sentence that is in the simple present to the simple present passive, what you're going to do is that the structure is going to be the subject followed by am, is, or are, depending on who the subject is, and then the verb in the past participle. Let's take a look at examples that we have right here. First one says, I sent a letter. When it changes to passive voice, we have a letter is sent by me. As you can see, the agent by me is not mandatory. That is why we can include it or we can omit it. The second example is going to be, the student reads a book. It becomes, a book is read by the student. Next one we have, Thomas bakes a cake, and it becomes, a cake is baked by Thomas. And finally we have, she writes reports, and that becomes, reports are written by her. Two things that I want you to notice here is that when you want to include the agent at the end of the sentence, if this agent used to be a subject like you, he, she, we, they, please remember that in that case, it's going to become an object pronoun at the end of the sentence, after by. So let's take a look at the fourth example. She writes reports. When it changes to passive voice, we don't say reports are written by she. We have to use the object pronoun. And then we say reports are written by her. There you have the object pronouns in case you need to remember what the object pronouns are. For I, it's going to be me. For you, it stays you. For he becomes him, she becomes her, it stays the same. We becomes us, and they becomes them. Okay? Another example is the first one, when we say I send a letter, but when we change it, it becomes a letter is sent by me. A letter is sent by me. So always be careful with that if you decide to include the agent and if the agent is a pronoun. Okay? So let's see if we can practice a little bit. Here we have 4 sentences. Please take a look at the sentences. You can pause the video and see if you can turn them into passive voice in the simple present. The first one says, people produce cars in this factory. Second one, the farmer grows carrots in his field. 3, Mrs. Lawrence milks her cow twice a day. And finally, Alexander plays golf every Sunday morning. Okay, let's see if you were able to get it. So, here are the answers. Cars are produced in the factory. Carrots are grown in his field. The cow is milked twice a day. Golf is played every Sunday morning. Here we didn't include the agent, but it's optional. If you wanted to include it, then that's also perfect. Okay, and this is how we can use the passive voice for sentences in the simple present. Now let's talk about the past simple passive. In this case, when a sentence is in the simple past and then you want to change it to passive voice, the structure is going to be subject followed by was or were. Remember that this is going to depend on the subject. And then the verb in the past participle, again. Because of that, it's really important that you remember that you will always need to use the past participle in the passive voice. So be really careful with regular and irregular forms. You can practice irregular verbs just to remember a little bit which is the past participle form of the verbs. Okay, in this case we have some examples in active voice. Let's see how it changes to passive voice. First, I sent a letter becomes a letter was sent by me. The student read a book becomes a book was read by the student. Thomas baked a cake becomes a cake was baked by Thomas. She wrote reports becomes reports were written by her. Okay? Please remember that the form of be needs to agree with the new subject. Okay? So for example, in the last one, she wrote reports. In the active voice, the subject was singular, she. However, when we change it to passive voice, the new subject is reports, which is plural. That is why the be form now is were. Reports were written by her. So again, remember that the form of be needs to agree with the new subject. Let's practice a little bit more. Here we have 5 sentences. Take a look at them and let's see if we can turn them into passive voice. Remember to use was or were and then a verb in the past participle. Let's check it out. Okay, so here we have. This book was written by Jane Austen. This picture was painted by Taras Shvenko. The flowers were watered yesterday. The cake was baked by me. America was discovered by Christopher Columbus. That's great. So finally, before we finish, how can you know, how can you tell if a sentence is active or passive? It's very easy. You just need to ask yourself, is the subject of this sentence doing or receiving an action? If the subject is doing an action, then it's active voice. But if the subject is receiving an action, that means that it's passive voice. For example, when I say Mary cooks dinner, Mary is doing the action of cooking, so this is active voice. However, when I say the dinner is cooked, of course, the dinner cannot cook itself. It's not doing an action, so that means that it's receiving the action of being cooked. That makes it passive voice. So, to finish, we have that we are going to use this passive voice to emphasize an action or when the doer is unknown or irrelevant. The verbs are always going to be in the past perfect. Make sure that be agrees with the subject and the time or tense that you want. Don't forget that the doer becomes an agent in passive voice and that you should be practicing irregular verbs to have your sentences perfect all the time. Thank you so much for watching.